I'm thrilled to be back at Stanford. When I say back at Stanford, I didn't study here. In fact, I do not have an MBA, as you'll spot very quickly. But I had been here before, and it really is just a great place. I also had the chance of spending the weekend here and to get to know some of you. So to those of you that I've had the chance to meet over the weekend, could I just say thank you. You've given me a great welcome, given me a great feel for the place. I have to say, I think you guys really, really are lucky to get to spend 2 years here. Now, what I'd like to do with you this morning is to give you some perspectives on leadership. That's a topic you've been talked at a lot, I'm sure, and I hope you thought about a lot about. But I want to give you some perspectives. And I've chosen the word perspectives quite deliberately. I'm not going to talk about my personal leadership story. It'll be a very, very short presentation indeed if I did. But I want to talk to you about what I've observed in the many leaders or purported leaders that I've worked with over the last 35 years. So this is perspectives on leadership based on what I've seen and what I've heard. Not just in business. I've worked with people in the not-for-profit sectors and the public sector a little bit as well, and also for outside business as well. So it's really some general thoughts on leadership. And what I hope to do is I hope to give you some insights on what it takes to be a good leader, whether that's in business or in your personal life or whatever, some insights on leadership. And as it's a business school, maybe one or two things that you could do to improve your own personal leadership skills. So that's my hope, that if at least 20% of you leave with saying, I could do something with that, that would be really, really great. I'll talk for about 25 minutes, and then I'll thread open to Q&A. Anything you want to ask about what I said, what I didn't say, about the world at large, please just prepare your questions, and I'd be thrilled to have the chance to get involved in that. Now, before I start, let me just provide a few comments that I think frame the topic of leadership. Before I get into what I think that makes for a great leader, just some contextual comments. Firstly, leadership is a non-hierarchical concept in my view. It's a non-hierarchical concept. People often confuse positions of leadership with the exercise of leadership. There are many people who are leaders who, in my view, are not leaders at all. They happen to be in leadership positions. And there are many people who are not in positions of leadership who exercise leadership. Try and think of it as a non-hierarchical concept. It's independent of a position. There are some organizations that recognize it. The military is very, very good at recognizing this. They know that a sergeant or a platoon leader is a leader. Organizations tend to be less good. They assume that the more senior you are, the better the leader you are, and it is not true. So when I know this is called the view from the top, and Dean, perhaps have a suggestion from you. I think that leadership needs to be viewed from the bottom, from the middle, and the top. So maybe the next course you do have view from the bottom as a thought. I jest, but I think it's important. You look at leadership through many lenses, and good organizations, people are leaders at all levels, including secretaries, right up to the chairman. So it's a non-hierarchical concept. There are many CEOs and chairmen I've worked with that, in my view, are not particularly good leaders, and there are many people who are never recognized as good leaders who are very good leaders. And I'd like to focus on what I think are the good leaders. So that's point number one by way of context, non-hierarchical. Second point I'd like to make is that leadership is a multifaceted concept. It can be defined in a number of different ways. Most people think about business leaders or military leaders, but just step back and think. You can be a ring leader, you can be a gang leader, you can be a thought leader, you can be a fashion leader. These are all leadership. And one of the things I get uncomfortable about sometimes at business school is that leadership is often channeled through a very narrow prism. But remember, there are lots of different types of leadership, and it's very important that they can be very valuable. To me, one of the great developments of the last 20 years has been the emergence of the geek as a leader. And to me, it's a logical consequence of the move to the knowledge economy. As we move to a knowledge economy, you're going to have a lot more geeks as leaders. So I think there are numbers of different ones. And if you think about leaders and leadership, don't just dismiss the geeky, nerdy guys in the corner as not leaders. Some of them, I promise you, will surpass all of you as leaders. Same with fashion, same with social. So leadership is a multifaceted concept. When you talk about leadership, I think it's very, very important to talk about what sort of leadership are you thinking about. So it's non-hierarchical, it's multifaceted. And then the final point I'll make before I get into my views on what defines leadership, as you step back and think about it, is it is contextually driven. Now, you'll all been told this about context, but you cannot look at leadership in the isolation of the context that you're in. If I focus on the business world, if you're leading a company in the high-tech industry or the food industry, your challenge is completely different. If you're trying to lead McKinsey or the Graduate School of Business or a medical faculty or a regiment, your leadership task is completely different. If you're trying to lead a group of Japanese people or people from Brazil as opposed to a group from Silicon Valley, your leadership task is completely different. You have to understand context to understand leadership. This can be true within the same industry. If you are working with, we're in Silicon Valley, a big high-tech company, leading a high-tech company whose heritage is in Korea or Taiwan is completely different from leading a high-tech company whose heritage is in Silicon Valley or Munich, even though they may be making exactly the same products. So context is all when you think about leadership, and I'll come on to what I think that means for the development of one's own leadership skills. So some framing comments about at least one person's view on leadership is it's non-hierarchical, it's multifaceted, and it is context-driven. I have a view on leadership is that it cannot be defined by characteristics. Most of the books and most of the talks you'll get will tell you about what great leaders are. They're good listeners, they're authentic, they're dynamic. And my view on that, having watched for 30 years, is maybe. I've worked with some great leaders who listen appallingly. In fact, most of the good leaders I've worked with listen appallingly. Some are not very authentic. I'm not sure I quite understand what authentic means, but I think they're not very authentic if I've got it right. Some people have no vision at all and don't believe in it. I talked to one brilliant CEO who reminded me of the very, very good point. He said, the line between vision and hallucination is very small indeed, and I don't like it. Great leader, great leader. So I think generalizations about leadership characteristics, I personally think are interesting but not very helpful. And they're also not very helpful. You get people telling you how to be a great leader, and you just say, well, I'm not like that. Does that mean that you can't be a great leader? The answer is no, it does not. You have to define it in your own terms around you and your organization. So my view is that leadership is best explained by what leaders actually do. And remember, I'm not talking just about business leaders. It could be personal leaders. Parents, in some ways, are leaders. Think about that. Parents have more influence over people than virtually anyone. I want to talk about what leaders actually do. And in a sense, I'm trying to define leadership from the perspective of the followers. The followers. Sometimes I think it's when you're trying to define something, you look at it through a different prism, just like it's often easier to explain success by looking at mistakes. Sometimes it's easier to think about leadership by terms of followership. And I think, and this is my synthesis, and you may think it's rather sad commentary on my last 30 years, but when I look at the effective leaders that I've seen, I think that they all, whatever their walk of life, do 5 things. They all do 5 things, and I'd just like to go through the 5 things that they do. Not that they are, not what they say, but they actually do in the eyes of their followers. Number 1, all leaders set a direction. All leaders set a direction. It might be a vision, it might be a culture, but they set a direction. They might write it down. They might have a big plan, which has got McKinsey slides in it, saying this is our strategy. It might be just articulated. It might be never said. In family businesses, they're often never said. But there is a direction. And if you ask most people in the company, they will be able to tell you what that direction is, what the beliefs of the company are. All leaders do this. They can do it a number of different ways. Don't get hung up on technique. Focus on the direction. You might want to put strategy, vision. You fill in the dots for yourselves. But to me, I use the word direction. People in the organization know where they're going. They may not like it. They may not approve of it. They may disagree with it. But people in the organization know where the company is going or where the organization is going. So one thing that leaders do, in my view, is they set a direction. The second thing that leaders do, all leaders do, in my view, is that they initiate stuff. Leaders don't just manage the status quo. Now, sometimes initiating stuff can be stopping things happening. Some of the worst failures of leadership personally and in observation was in the dot-com boom and bust, when not enough of us stopped things that we knew were wrong happening. That's initiation. Going against a trend can be initiative, but usually leaders start things. I don't confuse this with entrepreneurship. It can be entrepreneurship. It's initiating things. They initiate change. They want to do things in pursuit of that direction. And I don't think, as I look back on the effective leaders that I've worked with, all of them have initiated things. A lot of not effective leaders have talked about initiating things. They talk about change. Beware of leaders that talk about change all the time, by the way. They spend more of their time talking about it than doing it often. But real leaders initiate stuff. So initiation, initiative, starting things. Innovate is part of that. It's different from innovation. We might want to talk about that. But they initiate things. So that is characteristic number 2. You set direction, and then you initiate things, usually around that direction. The third thing that leaders do, and I always emphasize this to MBA students, because typically very brilliant MBA types are bad at this. Leaders sustain momentum around those initiatives. They stick with them. This is why you often read, when you read books around leaders or lectures on how to be a great leader, you hear the word tenacity, determination, bullheadedness, obstinacy. That's the extreme of sticking with it. But practical leaders I've worked with, there comes a point when, this is another fine line, when obstinacy becomes lunacy. There is a point at that. So, and as you know, a lot of very strong leaders do go into the lunacy phase of obstinacy. They stick with things. And typically something I observe that MBAs are very bad at doing, they say, that didn't work, I'll try something else. And this is the danger of an entrepreneurial mindset. You don't stick with things. But entrepreneurial leaders stick with things too. So sticking with things, sustaining momentum, including through bad times, I think is a really, really important part of leadership. And you all know, even observation will tell you there are always things that are going to go wrong. And the real leaders, they stick with it. The wise ones know when to stop. We can talk about that. But in the end, the characteristic of leadership is sticking with things. Direction, initiative, sticking with it. The fourth thing that all leaders do in some form or another, in my view, is that they motivate others to do what they want them to do. They motivate people. I used to say, inspire. And then I realized from observation I was putting my own value judgment on motivation. I happen to think, like many of you, that being inspired is an incredible form of motivation. I've had to conclude that actually it's not true to say that all leaders inspire. There are a number of techniques of motivation. We've got nothing to do with inspiration at all. Greed is one. Some leaders are very effective at using greed as a motivator. Fear is another. Manipulation is another. Encouragement is another. There are various techniques of motivation. It's quite important for you not to impose your own moral values at this stage on what works. The point I'm making is that great leaders motivate people to do things. And the really great ones think, what will motivate those people to do it? How you harness those motivations and you get them consistent with the value set of a company is a huge issue in its own right. So you can't just say, I know Bill, money's his thing, I'll give him bonuses. I know Jane, she's got a strong social conscience, I'll let her indulge her not-for-profit instincts. You can't run an organization by motivating everybody differently and how you harness that. But in the end, all leaders think a lot about how do I motivate my team and my people to get what I want done or what I believe needs to be done. Motivation of the team. Selection is a part of it. Appointments is a huge part of it. It's a motivational team to who you appoint. But I just like to leave this idea of motivation, not inspiration, even though I think inspiration can be an incredibly powerful motivational technique for very talented, well-intentioned people. Not everybody, sadly, is like that. And I say some of the most effective leaders I have seen, I don't necessarily like it, and I certainly wouldn't necessarily want to spend my dinners with these leaders. They are brilliant at manipulating. So just try to avoid forming judgments on people at this stage and just talk about what makes for effective leaders. And then the final point, the final characteristic, at least I see it, of leaders is that all leaders, whatever their sector, lead by example. They may not think about it, they may not talk about it, but they do it. Whenever they say something or they do something, people notice. In organizations, people are boss watchers. It's just a human instinct to just look up. You may not like what you see, but people watch and they listen, and they watch what people do, and they listen to what they say, and they look for the difference. And all the work you'll have done, there's a huge amount of academic research on this, is that people, they watch, and they look, and they listen, and then they see what the differences are. And that's what the example. That's the example. When people get up and bang on, we're a values-driven organization, we really believe that, and then at the next meeting you get beaten up because you missed your budget by 2%, that's what people notice. And it's exaggerated by the talk. People do not take examples from what they hear, they take the examples from what they see and what they observe in terms of human behavior. So all leaders lead by example. Now there's some pressures on that. When you are in a leadership position, it means that whatever you say or do becomes an act of leadership by example. But all leaders do that, and the thoughtful ones think about that all the time. One of the best, in fact, the best talk I've ever heard on leadership, which covers all the 5 points and the non-contextual point, and it was an impromptu one. It was it wasn't a speech, it was a talk by a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant in the British Army, who'd been in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. He was a private in Iraq and he'd become a sergeant by Afghanistan. And he talked about leadership. This is from the bottom, about what, and it was the best controlled experiment. He'd worked with 5 different officers, 3 of whom he thought were great, and 1 of whom he thought was truly terrible. He talked about his own leadership experience. And the one, it was absolutely mesmerizing. I mean, he's a very bad talker, but it was mesmerizing in terms of content. But what he absolutely was saying was the leadership by example of what people do, particularly under fire, literally under fire, is what you remember. Just remember that as well. You think about leadership by example. All of you, when you leave here, will be watched as leaders, and it's what you do and what you say and the difference between the two that people actually notice. So let me recap before I conclude my talk. I've tried to give you some framing comments on leadership, about its non-hierarchical, it's multifaceted, and it's shaped by context. Do think about that. And then I've 5 thoughts on what I believe defines what leaders do. They set a direction, they initiate stuff, they stick with it, they think hard about motivation, and they know that they always lead by example, whatever they do and they say. And I think that framework, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, I think can hopefully help define what is a good leader. Now, I just want to conclude. I'm looking at the time, but let me just finish. This is a business school, so I probably should finish with some tips and suggestions on how you, as individuals, can become, if you want to, can become better or more effective personal leaders. And I think what I'm going to say is true not just for your careers, and I imagine all of you are going into entrepreneur, consulting, tech, but some of you hope to be going into academia or the public service. Maybe some of you are going to focus on being a parent. And I hope this will be relevant to all of you, every single one of you in this room, about some tips on how you might become a more effective personal leader. This will only resonate with you if what I've said in the last 20 minutes has. If not, look at your Blackberries now. It's a good time to do that. The first thing that I think you can do is spend a bit of time thinking about the context point. I mean, really thinking about it. And by context, I mean, when you join an organization, understand its history, its crises, its people, its culture, its values. Most of us spend more of our time complaining about our contexts than we do thinking about them. Generally, great leaders don't complain very much. Great leaders generally don't complain and they don't blame. They're thinking, they're saying, I'm not going to do that again. But just think about your context before. Many of you will be frustrated by your first jobs. You will be, it's just part of it, I was. But instead of getting too frustrated, just think about it. Why is it? Why is it? And often it's a lack of understanding of the context of that organization. What are the goals of the founders? What are the goals of this organization? What are they trying to do? What are the things that have scarred them? Why do they do something so idiotic? If good people do something idiotic, they're probably not doing something idiotic, is my general observation. There's a reason. Spend time understanding the context. And that often it means spending time understanding the history, either of the founders or of the organization itself. So that'd be tip number one. Spend some time on that. Secondly, I've got to be careful about this with the Stanford GSP audience on this, because you get a lot of this, I know. But this self-awareness stuff is important. It is important. You can take it too far. I mean, you can spend too much time analyzing yourself. When you get caught at dinner talking to somebody who's going to the shrink for the last year, the most boring evening you'll ever have in your life. You learn more about people than you ever want to know. But nevertheless, the self-awareness stuff is really, really important. Not just how do you look at yourself and see yourself, that's important too, but how do others see you as a leader? Think about it. I'm a great believer in 360-degree feedback and feedback from others, but I'm not very impressed by how people use this feedback. They tend to take criticisms as something they've got to deal with and praise as something they've got to do more of. Not true. Not true. If you're a leader and you get a feedback, and I saw this a lot in my consulting career, really good guy, high standards, but really tough on teams, doesn't give credit enough. Don't necessarily be less tough on teams and give more credit. If that's what makes you a leader and motivates your teams, maybe it's the right thing. So think about the feedback. Or you get great feedback, lovely person to work with, really super, always look to work with him, and that's all the feedback is. That's some orange lights there. Are you pushing people hard enough? Are the quality standards half enough? So when you get feedback, don't just tick the pluses and say, well, I must correct the minuses. That is not the way that great leaders operate. They say, how does that feedback link to my leadership impact profile? I'm not saying ignore the criticisms, and I'm certainly not saying don't bask in the glory of praise if you get it, but think about it in terms of so what? So what? So that's tip number 2. Self-awareness in a leadership context, not just as a human being. Thirdly, leadership skills. I think leadership can be taught a bit. I think it can be learnt a lot, and I think it can be experienced a lot. Let me talk about what can be taught and learnt through coaching or through the classroom or through colleagues. And they are usually what I call classic leadership skills. Communications would be one. You can learn and practice how to be a better communicator. Strategic planning is another. Team building is another. There are some leadership skills that you can develop. EQ is another. There are some skills. So when you get your feedback, you think about, say, which skills can I get taught or can I practice? So think about that. There are some other skills, and this is tough for MBA types and consulting types. I would say this, because when you get to my age, you start saying things like this, but I believe it can only be learnt through experience. I think it's very, very different, maybe through reading and studying, but through experience. And this is the bugbear of people in a hurry. And these skills are skills like judgment, diplomacy, statesmanship, cultural sensitivity. It's very, very hard in a classroom setting or a peer group setting to learn these skills. I mean, if I take diplomacy, which I think is going to be an increasingly important leadership skill in globalizing business, unless you've been to a lot of countries, made a fool of yourself in a number of different cultures, seen other people get it right and get it wrong, been and lived in 3 or 4 different places, it's quite hard to get that sort of learning, and that takes time. As I said, and that's the enemy of most MBA training is time. But there are some skills that I just do think that experience is really important. And I urge you to think about that, because particularly of those of you whose careers will not get off to a rocket-like start, and it will be a third of you, and it will be difficult for you, don't give up on that. That could be the making of you. Could be the making of you. And for those of you, will be most of you, whose careers get off to a rocket-like start, don't get seduced by that either, because that could be the breaking of you as well. So just think about the experiential skills of leadership. I think that's a really, really important factor of it. So skills that can be taught, think about it, skills that can be learned. Final point, which is not a tip to do it, but it's a request. It's a request. Because I think, as Stanford grads or potential grads, either, in the summer or the summer after, I do think you have a bit of an obligation. And one thing I absolutely believe about leadership is that it can be nurtured. It can be nurtured. And this is, I think, one of the responsibilities of leadership is to nurture leadership in others. There are some institutions that do it really well, but most do not. We think about it in terms of ourselves. So as you get into positions of influence, when you can actually deal with potential leaders, think about nurturing leadership. What do I mean about that? One, give people, everyone you work with, and I'm talking about your assistant, I'm talking about your peers, I'm talking about everyone, give them a leadership opportunity. And that does not mean a bigger model to run, necessarily. It doesn't mean a bigger responsibility or a bigger salary. Give them a leadership opportunity where they can exercise a different, go back to my 5-part framework, give them an opportunity. It's amazing the payback you get. And the really great leadership organizations, not the great leadership leaders, the great leadership organizations are one that really, really focus on giving everyone leadership opportunities. You've got to accept that some people will not be able to take those opportunities and some people will fail. That's part of it. You've got to give opportunities in a very, very thoughtful way. The second one is encouragement. Encourage people. It's an obvious point. All of us like encouragement, and anybody says they don't care about it is lying. We all like it, but it really does make a huge difference. But it only makes a difference if it's accompanied by challenge. Most companies, and there are quite a lot in the US like this, which are what I call great job cultures. Great job, Joe. Great job, Jane. They're not usually very strong leadership cultures. Because if the challenge isn't there and the standards aren't there, the encouragement can diminish an organization. So with encouragement comes challenge and standards and pushback. You see this in parenting in particular. It's a very difficult, I don't know if we have anybody who's a mum or dad here, but that balance between encouraging your children and pushing them, very, very important task. I believe this is true for organizations. This is a combination of setting the standards, challenging, criticizing, and encouraging. Something for you to think about. I think it's really, really something important. So if I could just leave sort of 4 thoughts before I shut up and throw it open to just questions. Think a lot about your contexts. Think about yourselves as leaders, not just in terms of feedback. Think about building your skills through teaching, coaching, learning, reading, and through experience. And then finally, think about your obligation to nurture leadership in others. I will stop there. I hope 1 or 2 things I said resonate. If not, this is your chance to correct me. So please, questions.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. One of the most interesting
things... Could you just say who you are and what, first year, second year, slowly?
Oh, my name is John Jung. I'm a first year here. So one of the most interesting things about business school has been talks like these where we kind of learn heuristics about, what makes a good leader. And, so thank you. But I just had a question about your framework. One of the things that I noticed, and you said something kind of interesting, which was that you shouldn't impose kind of moral judgments on the decisions that people make in the way that they decide to motivate other people. And that kind of goes against a heuristic that I've learned about leadership, which is that leadership should come from a place of kind of good or ethical morals or judgments. How do you kind of bring those together? Because I think I look at the framework and a lot of it is consistent with kind of people who have political leaders of infamy, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's my question.
It's a great question, and if I implied that there isn't, well, I don't believe it. There isn't a role for moral and ethical leadership in business. I think it's wrong. My point was that when you look at what leaders do, some of them are not ethical people or not moral, and you should observe that. I think that is not the sort of leader that any of you, I hope in this room would ever want to be or would ever want to work, and I wouldn't. But my point was that when you're cold-bloodedly analyzing leadership, you've got to look at what they do. Now, let me just take an example. I came from an organization which likes to style itself and is a values-driven organization, not in a superior way. It just runs like a lot of, and Johnson & Johnson I work with is a values-driven organization. And everybody says, well, that's very good and nice and all the rest of it. But the best book on a values-driven organization that I've ever read is was around the Salamon's trading floor in the 1980s. And that was a values-driven organization. And those values were horrible. They were horrible. But they were effective for a time. And that was the point on the time. There was no ethic about it. They had you eat what you kill. The guy who earns the most money is the top dog, and to get promoted. That was our values. And my point was that worked as a leadership organization for a bit, but it wasn't sustaining. And the real leaders, which they didn't see, didn't add an ethical judgment. So what I was trying to say was, just look at what makes this organization work and then say, how am I going to change it? And do I want to be part of it? And I absolutely agree that I would never work, and I hope nobody in this room would ever work with an organization that doesn't have good moral and ethical principles. But prepare yourself for the fact that there are some effective leadership organizations that do not, or have different ethics and morals from what you have. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you for the question. So, I think it's a really crucial part of leadership, moral leadership. But don't prejudge until you know what the context is. Is it ladies first or right left? I'm not sure. We'll go to the right. We'll go over here. So.
All right. Hi. Thanks for coming. I'm Omar, first here. As someone who comes from an organization who seems to value MBAs a lot, or an MBA degree, and doesn't have an MBA himself, I was wondering what you think are the benefits and maybe setbacks an MBA has.
Well, I could say, having heard me as non-MBA talk, you're probably better able to judge that than I am. I don't think it matters, in a sense. McKinsey's a big MBA. I think it matters. And let me just say why, which is not to say I don't think an MBA doesn't matter, because I think MBA is incredibly valuable. And I'm a passionate proponent of MBAs, by the way. I am of all tertiary education. Well, let me just say, for example, I come from when I was at McKinsey, everybody thinks McKinsey is an MBA school. Under 50% of McKinsey people have MBAs. Under 50%. So we hire a lot of MBAs, more than anybody, and 35% now have PhDs. So it's not an MBA sort of, I think MBA, the key is the talent. The key is the talent, always the talent, the talent, the talent. And the truth is that a lot of very motivated, high talented people do MBAs. They do. This is just in this room. I know. I don't know hardly any of you. I just know there's an awesome amount of talent here. That's why firms like mine are here primarily. It's not, I don't want to be rude, Dean, but it's not because you're Stanford MBAs, it's because you're just really talented people and you're here. And that's point one. The second thing is I think MBAs and also a JD or being a medicine or an engineer adds a discipline and a network in a social school which is irreplaceable. I think it is irreplaceable, you know that, and I've seen that over the weekends. It adds a lot of value. And thirdly, I think this is less true now than it was when I was young. It teaches you techniques and skills that you need in business. Now, I say that because I've noticed a lot of MBAs now have a consulting background or been in a hedge fund or investment banking, and they know a lot of stuff where they come. And I would imagine this is a challenge. When I was young, when I joined McKinsey, I did not know what discounted cash flow was. It would have been nice to have had an MBA before I had to go through that hell of that first year. But you could do that. So I think for some people, and I hope some of you, the technical skills are important, the network is important, the chance to have tertiary education, get the discipline that is really, really valuable. But do I fundamentally think that MBAs, choir MBAs will change your life? No, I do not. I think it's a favor.
Hi, my name is Vicky Slavin. I'm an MBA 1, and I spent 3 years at McKinsey, as a caveat to my question. One of the things we've been learning about in strategy classes is the difference between management and leadership. Management being setting targets and helping people meet them and some such things, and leadership is inspiring others. Would you characterize the work that McKinsey does and other consulting firms as management or leadership primarily?
I wouldn't recognize the difference. I think it's very difficult to lead effectively without managing, and it's very difficult to be a very good manager without at some point leading. So to say management about is performance and assessment, I mean, how can you do that and not do that in a motivational? So I think it's a bit of a bogus dichotomy. Personally, I'm probably going exact opposite of what you've been taught in your classes. I think at some point in a business organization at least, and I'd certainly see this, and if you want to see the truth of this, go and work in the not-for-profit sector or the social sector, where you see leadership and no management, and it's usually a disaster, a complete disaster in leadership terms. So I think leadership and management are inextricably combined at some point, and really good management organizations always have some leadership capacity. It's a long question, I know what you're saying. I think when it comes to consulting, I don't know, I think people make a lot of faff about consulting and business. I think they're much, much more senior. And in the end, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get stuff to happen. That's what you're trying to do, and you can do it independently or dependently. So I think that's much, much less different, which is why a lot of consultants very seamlessly go and work for big organizations or entrepreneurial. It's no big deal. So I think that the differences between careers are grossly exaggerated. I mean, when you're in the goldfish bowl of an MBA class, you know, you're trained to pick on differences and then magnify them. I would say this is one of those examples. So that's my personal view. So.
Thank you for the opportunity to hear about your experiences. Put yourself in a New York City courtroom. District Attorney of New York comes up to you and says, "Do you have any reason to believe Rajat Gupta is guilty?" What would you say?
I've known Rajat Gupta. This is in connection with the Galleon case, obviously very distressing for people at McKinsey and anybody who knew Rajat Gupta. I've known Rajat for many, many years. I like him a lot, and I've seen him do a massive amount of good things. I don't know what happened on the legal court side. I do not think he is a bad person. I've seen him do too many good things. Whether stuff happened, this is all I don't know. We'll have to see. But I will defend, and I do, as Rajat as a person and what he did, I will defend absolutely. Has he done some inappropriate things? It doesn't look very good, and that's obvious. So that's my answer to that.
Hi, my name is Josiah Filler. I'm an MBA 1. Thank you for speaking to us. My question has to do with the balance between kind of for-profit interests and also social goals. I think a lot of us came to the GSP because we have lofty social aspirations, want to change the world, but also are hampered by this desire to establish ourselves professionally and be successful in that realm. As somebody who's done a really good job of balancing both, but skewed, it seems, more in the for-profit sector, but then it had tremendous impact on both. Any guidelines or recommendations for how we can do that for the next 10, 20, 30 years, and when it makes the most sense to kind of jump into the social realm to have the most impact?
Well, I think you're saying it. I'm not sure I have had as much impact I'd like on social problems. Again, I personally wouldn't frame it the way that you have. I think if you want to change the world and do good for the world, you can do it through the private sector or the public sector or the social sector. And on the whole, I think more progress on social problems has come through the private sector than the not-for-profit sector. So good intentions, go back to my leadership framework, good intentions is not the same thing as impact. And when I see the appalling waste and incompetence in Africa, where I spend a lot of time, or in India, I would challenge that. Do not assume that because you want to be a hedge fund manager or go into consulting and iBanker that you cannot and are not doing social good. I think it's grossly arrogant for people to say that and do not assume that because somebody works for a non-profit, they are really good people who want to do good. Do not assume that. And I've seen it. If you are running a big company or running a successful private equity firm, you build companies, you earn a lot of money, you pay a lot of taxes, and you spend time nurturing leadership, you're doing good. So don't get trapped by to do good, you've got to be in the social sector, and if you're in private equity or you're a bad, it's just not true in my observation. I personally, I'm more of a parable of the talents type of person. And I'm very interested in social problems. I believe that the big problems of the world are now in the social domain, and I think the social sector has a role to play. I think the private sector has a huge role to play as well, and I think government does too. That's why I'm trying to get at that work. But let me just bore you for 2 minutes. The parable of the talents. Those of you with some Christian religious backgrounds will know this is a story about encouraging someone to do what they are good at. And the best example I know was a friend of mine at McKinsey, when I was at McKinsey, who was a director in the Italian office of McKinsey. And he was really, he looked like an Armani model, immaculate suits, yellow Porsche, you know, he sort of made you sick when you looked at him to do that. And he was a really nice guy too, which made it even worse. And he had a very, very strong social, genuinely, so he was always agonizing with guilt. He said, I have so much money, and he said, I want to do that. And he said, on the other hand, I love my suits, and I love my Porsche. And, you know, and a lot of us go through that dimension. And anyway, he couldn't stand anymore, and he resigned. He said, I'm going to set up, I'm going to go and work for a charity in Madagascar. He had a thing about Madagascar. He said, I'm going to go and devote myself to an orphanage in Madagascar, which he used to go to every summer for his holiday. That's what he did. He didn't go to Sardinia, he went back. So this is a guy, very, very strong social conscience, but, you know, if you saw him, you'd say, a hedgie if ever I saw one. Now, the point was, what do you do with that? And I remember, this is a brilliant piece of leadership. The managing partner in Italy, I also knew very well, because this guy talked to me a lot, and what do you do? And I said, I don't know. I said, you seem in a muddle. Why don't you take a few weeks off and think about it? It wasn't getting anywhere. But the managing partner said to him, he said, Leonardo was his name. He said, Leonardo, he said, is this the best thing you can do? He said, I've watched you, and you are a brilliant consultant and financier. And I don't know if you'd be a very good orphanage manager. Why don't you do what you're good at and give your money to people who can build an orphanage? And that's what he's done. He stayed at McKinsey. He's very happy. He's got 2 Porsches now. And he gives practically all his wealth. And the orphanage has 1,400 people. Now, who had the biggest impact on social society? If he'd gone there and been a well-intentioned social worker, doing great things, maybe feeling good about it. I'm talking about impact now. Go back to leadership. Impact. What did he do? I think he's had more impact. So I applaud you and encourage you for your instincts, but think hard about how can you have the most impact on social problems, and in your context of yourself is my point. So remember the story of Leonardo and the Porsches and the Madagascar.
Thank you.
We've been here for like 10 minutes.
Mr. Davis, thank you very much for coming. My name is Peter Passot. I'm a second year here. My question is more along the lines of the personal costs and sacrifices required to be a great leader. And so when you see these great leaders, where has it gone well in managing the costs and sacrifices of leadership, and where have they done poorly?
This is it's a great question, and we could talk about rage. And this is a bit generational. When I was starting off, you know, work was by far the dominant thing. It was mostly male-oriented. So this is a classic, by the way. I notice when you talk about work-life balance and the pursuit of happiness, you get people like me to come and talk. You don't. You really want 35-year-olds who are wrestling with this problem to talk to you about how they're coping with it. So I'm not saying either I or my generation's best. Another tip for you, get somebody who's a young partner at Goldman Sachs who's got 3 kids, and a husband who's a corporate lawyer to come and talk about work-life balance. It's a lot more useful than people like me talk about it. I have to say, this is my experience, but certainly for entrepreneurs, they don't really get the question. They're obsessed. You know, work is life. That thing is their life. And their families are just around that. And they have very good families, by the way. So I have to say that you do not want to hear this, but it's my observation. The truth is a lot of great leaders don't really get the question. We are slightly obsessive. Not a good answer. I'm just giving it as I see it. So at some point, and this is particularly true for entrepreneurs, the question is almost, I don't get where you're getting. For those of you that really think about trying to juggle the balls, and it's particularly true when children come along, I think for most people, and it's not just mums, by the way, it's true for dads too, that's a really defining thing about how you're going to make it work. I don't know, I just don't know the answer. I've seen so many people go through this. I think in the end, sort of muddling through is not bad. Money really helps. If you can throw money at the problem and get a couple of nannies and a driver, it helps. Don't laugh at it. No, it just, it helps. If it really doesn't help deciding who is going to take the primary burden, doesn't have to be the woman is one, doesn't have to be you. Trying to get in careers that are more flexible. But I think in the end, it's segment of one stuff muddling through. The only thing that I would say is, and I saw a lot of this at McKinsey, particularly with women, very able women who loved the firm but couldn't make it work and all the rest of it leave, is that don't assume because you adopt for a different work-life balance that you will suddenly be more fulfilled. And the truth is, I mean, in a sense, all of us are cursed. We're cursed by ability and ambition and education. And you can't just switch it off. You can't just switch it off. And I think in the end, you've just got to decide for yourself a balance of fulfillment and life and its segment of one stuff, but not get too neurotic about it. And if you get too neurotic about it, I think the worst thing you can be there is not fulfilled. If you are trained to be a leader, trained to be a multi-billionaire, trained to be the best techie in the world, you've got to do what you've got to do. And I think most families adjust to that. If you're talking about family work-life balance, then there's personal interest, you just got to muddle through. It's a very, very long answer. That's one thing that does get easier as you get older. And it's much tougher, and I remember this, when you're 25 or 30, when you're older, and when I was elected the managing partner of McKinsey, my wife spotted before I did. She said, this is going to be a tough 6 years. And then she said, that's okay. The next 6 years could be for you. But the next 6 years after that will be for me. That's a way of muddling through. And it was. And she said, you got to do it. And I said, look, I got it. And I knew I was going to be gone. I was. And she said, that's okay. I understand you've got to do it. And boy, am I paying back now? She said, no. The trouble is, I do know that when you're 27, you say, honey, for the next 6 years, it doesn't work. I know that. You negotiate in 3 months chunks when you're 27. I know that. So it's not very, I think there's no answer. You've just got to recognize, my point about self-awareness, you are high-achieving people. And if you suppress that, bad things will happen. And you see it with high-achieving mums say, I gave it all up to look after my children. They're often doing a lot of other stuff just because they're not working. Same with men as well. Sorry, long answer. I'm basically, I don't know. Just figure it out.
Thank you very much.
I'll just do one last question. Is that all right? And then we'll break for lunch.
My name is Kamal Naji. I'm an MBA too. My question is regarding your country, the UK. As you know, it's probably going to go into recession over the coming few months. And in your role advising the government, what are your solutions for both the private and the public sector in order to prevent the UK from going to recession? And do you think it's preventable? What's going to happen?
Well, certainly not by me. I think the next year is done. I mean, it's so much is in the control of the financial markets. I mean, I think Europe is going to have a very, very difficult period. My own view is that the credit crisis in Europe hasn't caused the current problems, they've exposed them. And these problems have been building over 15 years. We sort of knew it, but it's now very, very clear. And when you've had a 15-year problem that's exposed, you do not solve it in 2 or 3 years. You know that. You understand better than I do about imbalances and rebalancing. And all this recession, it'll be what it will be. I think there's going to be a lot of grief in Europe in the next 2 to 3 years. My view is, and I'm saying in the government, look beyond it. And I have nothing to offer now about how you manage through a recession, fiscal stimulus, all the rest of it. It's very, very tricky. Look beyond it. What are you going to do that will take it forward? And then I think you go back to the fundamentals of productivity, innovation, encouraging enterprise, all those sorts of things. So the role to any I'm training is on productivity, innovation, getting into sectors, encouraging the country to move into sectors that will offer it. It's nothing to do with the next 2 to 3 years. I think that's really not very solvable. The one thing I am working on is civil service reform and public sector. A huge issue in the Western world is public sector productivity. And productivity leads to growth. You know that. I know that. Most people don't get it. They think that productivity is about cutting jobs, but productivity and growth are the same thing, fundamentally. When your public sector is 50% of GDP, which it is in most European countries, you have to get it as productive as the private sector. And there's a huge task on that. doesn't mean less jobs necessarily. I mean, if you take the health sector, the productivity could increase by 30% easily. And all those people could be re-employed in the health sector for greater output. So the thing that I'm focusing on is productivity in the public sector, civil service reform, using some of the skills. I've got to be careful. It's a very different mindset in the sector and really get it. But public sector productivity is going to be huge. And when people say to me, my final comment, you know, the biggest problem in the Western world is greed. It's not. It's entitlement. Entitlement is the biggest single problem we have to capture. We have to challenge that in the public and in the private sector. Thank you for the question. Thank you very much.